Okay, so welcome back, everyone. My name is Michael Saricki, and this is part 5 in our continuing in-depth lecture series on the history of video games. For the last few episodes, including this one, we've been doing the history of games before video games. So, and in fact, when we last left off, we were discussing the history of modern sports. Um, we had gone over how it started with rather humble beginnings, from essentially a way to corral sort of unruly schoolboys into the institution we have today, as well as we also discussed sort of the origins of many of the sports that we commonly watch or play today, and so yeah, let's head over to the slideshow. Just give me a second. Okay, good. It's showing up. Okay. So next we're going to take a look at the history of the modern Olympics. Um, in 1894, the International Olympic Committee was founded by French aristocrat Pierre de Coubertin. We discussed him earlier. He was the guy who was more or less responsible for importing British sports culture to the continent, to sort of France and the rest of Europe. And of course, his goal was to revive the ancient Olympic Games, which hadn't been played since 394 CE. And really, he wanted to utilize sports to foster an attitude of international cooperation and respect, which wasn't a completely out there idea. The original Olympics had kind of served a similar function among the various city states of ancient Greece, although that certainly didn't stop them from continually waging war on each other. Though it did kind of help to create a sense of sort of pan-Hellenic identity for them. Now, in April of 1896, the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, Greece. 12 nations were represented with. Hold on, let me just double check something. Yeah, I thought so. Hold on. Yeah, sorry, I wanted to check something. With 12 nations represented, with 240 athletes competing across 43 different events. Many of these events were sort of modernized takes of ancient ones. You had stuff like the discus, javelin throw, hammer throw, stuff like that, as well as various track and field events. This event also saw the very first marathon race, which was created as an homage to the legendary runner Phidippides. I probably mangled that. It was said to have run from Marathon to Athens to bring news of Persia's defeat at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Although supposedly he dropped dead like immediately after arriving in Athens and delivering the message. He was so exhausted. Needless to say, they didn't exactly want to copy that aspect of it. Now, obviously, many more countries would join over the years, and the Olympics would grow quite a bit. Although the 1896 Olympics were definitely a success, and it was decided that the games would continue and would be held every 4 years in a new city. So in the year 1900, the Olympics were held in Paris, France, and in 1904, the Olympics were held in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, unfortunately, the early Olympics definitely had some growing pains that they had to go through. There were definitely some fumbles here and there, and that was very much seen in the 1904 Olympics, which is widely considered to be the worst modern Olympics. This event suffered from numerous organizational and logistical problems. First off, it wasn't even supposed to be in St. Louis anyway. I believe it was originally supposed to be held in Chicago or something, but the idea was that, but at the time, the World's Fair was being held in St. Louis. So they sort of threatened to overshadow the Olympics if it wasn't moved to their city. So they were kind of able to blackmail the Olympic Committee. Um, and unfortunately, first off, there were some issues in that St. Louis is rather far inland, and at the time, it was the U.S. didn't really have the infrastructure to easily allow people from all over the world to sort of gather at that place, to sort of get there very easily. And also, few countries showed up to begin with due to the ongoing Russo-Japanese War. But of course, the biggest sort of disaster that occurred was the marathon, which was quite humorous in that it really just went horribly wrong. Like, several of the contestants almost died. Like, I'm not joking. There was just incompetence all around, and it was due to a combination of sort of incompetence and sort of gross negligence and macabre experimentation. It's a very fascinating story. We don't really have time to go into it today, but if you're interested, I definitely suggest there's a really funny video on YouTube by a channel called Blue Jay that goes over the 1904 Olympic Marathon. I definitely recommend checking that out. So eventually, the Winter Olympics were created in January of 1924. The first one was held in Charnarix, France. I'm not sure if that's probably not how you pronounce it. Now, obviously, the Winter Olympics was a modern conceit because the ancient Greek Olympics didn't have it because it being a sort of Mediterranean climate, they didn't exactly have many winter games. Um, but of course, this modern winter Olympics focused on various winter sports like bobsledding, skiing, and curling. I've weirdly enough, I've always found the Winter Olympics to be the more interesting of the two Olympics. I don't know. Am I alone in that? Um, I don't know. I kind of just think that the sports that they show off are a bit more exciting, in my opinion. That could just be me. The Winter Olympics are held every 4 years. They are sort of midway between the summer events, so they sort of alternate every 2 years. So you've got the Summer Olympics, then 2 years later Winter Olympics, then 2 years later Summer Olympics again, etc. Now, one important aspect of the modern Olympic Games is this sort of tension between nationalism and internationalism. As stated previously, it was created out of a dream of international cooperation. It was very much sort of born out of the optimism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, wherein it was believed that human progress could eliminate many of mankind's ills. And it sought to sort of replace national animosities and hatred with friendly competition and war with sports. And as we kind of discussed before, this wasn't a completely out there idea. It had been noted that sports kind of had a bit of a civilizing effect in that it sort of tended to civilize more savage acts like warfare. Um, but the thing is that this idea of international cooperation and mutual respect very much came into direct conflict with the rise of nationalism that occurred at the same time. Nationalism emphasized the supremacy of one's own nation, often to the exclusion and detriment of others. Now, obviously, it did have some positive effects at the time. Like, this was sort of the period when the idea of the modern nation state came into being, and it led to ideas of self determination and stuff like that. But it also led to sort of a deepening of the sort of fear and hatred between different nations and nationalities. It led to greater animosity. It led to it basically was in part what helped cause the two world wars. And needless to say, today it's very much seen as kind of a bad thing for fairly obvious reasons. It led to some very bad things happening historically. But this conflict between nationalism and internationalism would help to shape modern sports as we know them today. Now, the nationalists initially opposed things like sports and the modern Olympics, seeing it as radically liberal and sort of utopian nonsense. As I mentioned before, when sort of sports culture was brought to places like France and Germany, it was initially viewed with a great deal of suspicion and hostility that over time did kind of melt a bit. Over time, the stance shifted to instead utilize national sports and athleticism as a way to showcase one's national superiority. So it was kind of the idea, even though the Olympics were designed with internationalism in mind, the nationalists would kind of co-opt the idea. Now, this can be very clearly seen in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Initially, it was hosted by Nazi Germany, and initially the Germans didn't really know what to do with these Olympic events. It had kind of been decided that Berlin would be the site of the 1936 Olympics back during the days of the Weimar Republic, and then when the Nazis took over, initially they didn't really know what to do with it, but eventually they kind of settled on the idea of using it as a propaganda tool to promote an image of a new Germany, unified, strengthened, and revitalized under National Socialism. Attempted to sort of romanticize and sort of whitewash what was going on in Germany, and also it attempted to sort of obfuscate many of the regime's anti-Semitic and racist policies, and it worked for them. It worked and it didn't. There were a number of countries that ended up boycotting the games because of these various policies, but the U.S. was not one of them, which did lead to a good amount of controversy at the time. And it was intended to sort of showcase the supposed superiority of the German people, of the Aryan race. This they were partially successful because on the one hand, Germany did end up winning the majority of gold medals at this event, and there was a lot of like pomp and circumstance, and they really did kind of use it to sort of attempt to show the supposed superiority of the Aryan race, but it was also somewhat undermined through the efforts of African American athlete Jesse Owens, who won 4 gold medals in, I believe, various running events. And actually, I remember, like, back in the day, there used to be these sort of bumpers for the History Channel, and one that I remember really clearly was that they showed this event, and they said that on this day, it was, I might be misremembering the exact quote, but it was said, on this day it proved that Hitler's master race was no match for the human race, which, that was a really great quote. It very much sticks in my head. Unfortunately, World War II would put a stop to the Olympics for a while. It wouldn't come back until the 1948 London Olympics, as war tends to do. Now, of course, the end of World War II did not mean the end of the Olympics as a means for sort of expressing nationalism. In the wake of World War II, the Olympics and other international sporting events were used as a battlefield for the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were constantly competing to showcase the dominance and superiority of their respective communist and capitalist ideologies. And this kind of spilled over into to much of the rest of the world as well. It's sort of the split between the sort of democratic capitalist West and sort of the communist East, like the countries of the Warsaw Pact, for example. Um, there was very much the rivalry was very much intense. You might remember if you've ever seen the movie Rocky Four. Now, obviously, Rocky Four is kind of an exaggerated, almost sort of cartoony version of this, but the sort of spirit of it was very much. It is very much true to the sort of the spirit of Cold War athletics at the time. Um, and as these countries attempted to sort of prove their superiority, it led to a number of underhanded tactics being used. In particular, East Germany was especially notorious for the use of blood doping and steroid use, and this was actually very visible in when it came to their female athletes, because they would have like these really burly sort of like covered in hair women who it's clear were just roided to heck. Um, and I believe that they had a program where even as early as elementary school, they would start them on this program of steroid usage and blood doping and all that nasty stuff uh, that would lead to that sort of transformation in an attempt to get an edge. Um, and at times this got rather ridiculous. Like there was one particular incident. This was actually in a tournament, which I guess isn't really athletic so much as it is board games. But I don't really have a better time to explain this. Um, the rivalry with chess was very intense because the Soviets very much dominated the sport. And Americans in the West were constantly trying to sort of break their hold on it, and and there was one instance where a Soviet psychic showed up to an event, um, and the Westerners, not sure if it was the Americans or not, but the Westerners identified them as a psychic. So and they figured, oh my God, these guys are using the psychic to try and sabotage our efforts. So, what do you do then to counter that? Well, you bring in a second psychic. So, yes, you have a chess tournament where it basically turned into like a psychic duel between these two guys. Like I can just imagine. Like, can you just imagine like these two guys in the crowd just doing this to each other? Like it was every bit as stupid as it sounds. And yes, this really did happen. Uh, I swear, the Cold War could get ridiculous at times. It really could. Okay. So one thing that's also important to note with the rise in popularity of sports over the years was the rise of television. It would have a profound impact on the world of sports. Now, obviously, even before television, you had earlier broadcasts on radio, which go back as far as 1921 with the first radio sports broadcast. And that was kind of would see the birth of the sportscaster, because obviously you needed to explain to the listeners what was going on the field when you couldn't see it. It would prove to be very popular, but this format was very popular, but it was obviously limited by the lack of any sort of visual component. The 1936 Berlin Olympics was actually the first sporting event to be broadcast live on television. Though, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that it was really only very local. Like, not many people owned televisions at the time. And even then, it was kind of just like, I believe it was only like people in Berlin could actually tune in to watch it. There certainly wasn't any kind of international broadcasting for it. But by the 1950s, TVs had become a common feature in many households, and one of the most common things to watch were sports. Obviously, it doesn't really cost a whole lot to produce it, not as much as a TV show you have to make from scratch. You just need to set up cameras and have some charismatic personalities to discuss it. Now, television helped bring sports to the masses. It allowed people all over the world to spectate different games and really kind of created a global community of sports fans. Without it, it's very much unlikely that sports fandoms would be anywhere near as massive as they are today, and entire cottage industries have sprouted around it. You've got not only commentary, but you've also got like speculation, where you've got when a game isn't on, people will just sort of discuss various plays and various, what the latest trade is and all kinds of stuff. You know, Today, television sports is bigger than ever. You've got several TV channels dedicated entirely to covering various sporting events, with billions tuning in to watch. In fact, I'm not sure. When I was a kid, I think I remember when ESPN was first introduced. My memory of it is a bit vague, but I remember that was kind of a big deal at the time. Like a channel entirely devoted to sports. And then they introduced ESPN2. And then I think by now there are like 4 ESPNs or something. So like it's very popular, needless to say. And it's very much the sort of thing where even in the poorest countries, people will gather around whoever has a TV and just watch and sort of cheer on their favorite sports teams. And in many ways, the way that we think of and imagine sports today is as much informed by the culture surrounding sports broadcasting as it is by the sports themselves. And in fact, and you can very clearly see this in video games, where they very much use sort of the trappings and the sort of the visual aesthetic of a sports broadcast. Uh, it's as much informed by that as anything else. So, in conclusion, modern sports and sports culture emerged from the culture present at British public schools in the 1800s. And from this primordial soup of various influences and games that young boys played to amuse themselves would emerge many of the games and athletic institutions that we take for granted today. These sports and general sports culture would spread all over the world, often as a direct result of colonialism and war, but also as a result of things like mass communication and so on. Often these sports were utilized for a variety of sociological and political goals. You have groups using it to promote goals of nationalism, but you also have it used to promote like greater cooperation within a society and stuff like that. And over time, this gave rise to communities that could unite people from throughout the globe. Nowadays, honestly, I'd be willing to bet that probably like 3/4 of the world's population is probably a fan of some sort of sport. Like I'm admittedly not really a fan of sports all that much. I'm vaguely aware of them, but I'm not really into them. But I'm kind of the exception to that. But yeah, it really has just become massive over really a relatively short amount of time, in the grand scheme of things. So if any of you guys have any questions, now would be a good time to ask. You feel free to chime in the chat. Okay. Looks like we do not have any takers. Alright, cool. So then I guess we'll move on. Next, we will be discussing the history of modern board games. Now, of course, we've gone over the history of board games previously, from sort of antiquity up to about the early modern period. But now we're going to go beyond that, and we're going to discuss sort of board games from the late 1700s onward. And it really, the industry really went through a number of different sort of events and transformations over the years that helped create the board games that we have today. Now, one event that had a massive influence on things was the Industrial Revolution. In the late 18th and into the 19th century would see the rise of industrialization, which drastically transformed the face of Western society in a massive number of ways. But of course, we're going to particularly focus on how it affected board games. With the rise of mechanized factories, it became possible to mass produce a wide range of consumer goods that could be sold more cheaply than ever before. You know, before it used to be you needed like a specific craftsman to make these board games by hand. Now you could just pump them out on an assembly line. This period also saw the emergence of a middle class with more free time and disposable income to spend on these consumer goods. You know, all of these would help to sort of usher forth a new era of board games. Another major thing that affected the trajectory of board gaming was the age of colonialism. You know, this era saw the creation of vast colonial empires and massive trade networks that spanned the globe. And obviously, you know, it led to some rather bad things, but we're not going to talk about that right here. In particular, European countries also began importing goods from their overseas territories and other countries, and this includes board games. And as a result, it means that now Western board games are now drawing influence from other board games found from all over. And we can see this with games like, say, Snakes and Ladders, which we had discussed previously, how it was brought to England and sort of adapted to the Western world. And European board games would also end up being exported overseas, and as a result, then those places would end up drawing influences from them. And this sort of exchange of different ideas and trade would evolve into the global board game network that we have today. The one I'm going to discuss here that is very popular throughout East Asia is Mahjong. Mahjong is it's a set building game similar to Rummy, and it's traditionally played with 4 players, although I believe that you can play with less in a pinch, but it's really meant to be played with 4. It was created around the middle of the 1800s in China, and around the 1850s, I believe. And I say around that time because I don't think anyone's ever managed to establish an exact date for when, like, the first Mahjong set was created. The research on that seems to be a little fuzzy. Now, a Mahjong game is played with a set of various tiles. A full set contains either 136 or 144 tiles. These include 5 or 6 suits, depending on if you have less or more tiles, each of which contain between 8 to 36 tiles. The game would especially become very popular in Japan. Well, it's very popular all throughout East Asia, as I mentioned, But in Japan, they play a variant called Rishi Mahjong, which is a very intricate game. It's very difficult to learn the rules of it because it has a lot of like weird cases and stuff like that. But it's one of those games that's kind of just ubiquitous there, to the point where if you take any Japanese console or any console that was sold in Japan, like one thing that you were guaranteed to find is about 1 million Mahjong video games. Like they have made an absurd number of them over the years, and it is insanely popular there. In the West, you maybe have played Mahjong Solitaire. This is probably best well known from things like the Shanghai series, as well as I believe it was offered for a while for free with Windows. Um, Although the thing is with Mahjong Solitaire is that aside from using the same tiles, it really has nothing to do with traditional Mahjong, and it didn't emerge until much later. Now, the period in the 1800s would see the rise of many major sort of board game creators and manufacturers, many of which would go on to last for quite a while. Um, One of the biggest was Milton Bradley. Milton Bradley was born in 1836, and he was a devout Quaker. And he would end up becoming one of the most influential figures in the history of board gaming. He started off as a draftsman before then gaining an interest in lithography. He opened his first lithography shop in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1860, and of course he called it the Milton Bradley Company, which, if you're old enough, you almost certainly remember many of their toys and board games. They were very much a household name back in the day. Now, lithography would prove to be a perfect means for mass producing various board games. His first game was the Checkered Game of Life, which we discussed previously when we were discussing the evolution of the Game of the Goose and how it eventually turned into the Game of Life. This was a big success, and it would end up selling over 440,000 units. And he would create many other board games before his death in 1911. And another thing that should be noted is that in accordance with Milton Bradley's religious faith, and this was kind of a common idea at the time, especially in Protestant countries, there was this idea that board games needed to teach some sort of moral lesson, that they couldn't just be fun to play. They couldn't just be frivolous. Eventually, this would sort of be let up on a bit, but we can see this with things like his Checkered Game of Life, which was meant to sort of model how a person should ideally live a good and virtuous life. Now, as mentioned before, the Milton Bradley Company would end up becoming one of the biggest board game companies in the world. It would produce countless classic games throughout the 20th century, although it was eventually acquired by Hasbro in 1984. And by the way, that's going to be a bit of a common theme here. Hasbro has basically acquired pretty much all of the classic sort of board game creators from like the 20th century. Hasbro has acquired them and is currently the one printing their games now. You could say that they formed almost a kind of monopoly over traditional board games in the U.S. There are still independent board game creators, and there are a lot of various companies doing some very interesting stuff. But in terms of like the classics that everyone remembers, Hasbro has kind of gained a stranglehold over that. So, another such company from this period was Parker Brothers. It was founded in 1883 in Salem, Massachusetts by George Swinnerton Parker when he was only 16 years old. As the name would imply, he eventually brought in his brothers into the business, and it was founded on the philosophy that games did not need to teach a moral lesson, could simply focus on being fun. This is an idea, of course, that we take for granted today, but at the time, again, it was kind of felt that board games, that gaming in general, needed to have some sort of moral component. That otherwise you were kind of just wasting your time. Or even worse, it could lead to you being like overly decadent. It could teach kids to be, heaven forbid kids learn that it's okay to have fun sometimes. Now, his games were originally handmade, although he eventually kind of scaled up. And from humble beginnings, Parker Brothers would grow into one of the most prolific board game publishers in the world. And it would remain a family owned business until it was acquired by General Mills in 1968. And then it was later purchased by Hasbro. Here they are again in 1991. Now, another popular game from this period was called Reversi, which you probably know as Othello, although that wouldn't come until a bit later. It was created in 1883 by either Lewis Walterman or John W. Mollett. Each sort of claims that they invented it, and it's kind of a whole dispute between them as to who truly created it. Basically, you take turns placing either black or white pieces, and surrounding either a black or one, and surrounding one or more pieces on two sides causes them to flip to your color, and you try to get the most pieces of your color in order to win. Eventually, Othello would receive would well, no, Reversi would be updated and turned into Othello in 1971 in Japan by Goro Hasegawa. Othello still remains fairly popular, although I believe it's especially very popular in Japan, and especially at the time. And in fact, one of Nintendo's first video arcade games, if not their first video arcade game, was actually a game called Computer Othello, which is exactly what it sounds like. And of course, we have Hasbro, the behemoth themselves. It was founded in 1923 by the Hassenfield brothers. And in fact, the name is actually a shortened version. It's Hasbro. Get it? They originally sold textile remnants and school supplies, but eventually shifted to making toys. Their first hit toy was Mr. Potato Head from 1952, famously featured in the Toy Story movies, although as you can see, the original version was quite a bit different, and it involved using an actual potato. They would shorten the name to Hasbro in 1968, and since then it has become one of the biggest toy and board game companies in the world. Really, its main competition is Mattel, although I believe that Mattel is more so focused on the toy end, whereas Hasbro is more so focused on the gaming end of things. And as I mentioned before, it's managed to buy out and acquire most of its competition, at least most of the really big and major companies, and it now owns all kinds of games, including stuff like Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons. So next we're going to talk about the Landlords game, which I'm going to just spoil it for you. This is the predecessor to Monopoly, and you can kind of tell from the design of the board. It was created in 1904 by Elizabeth Maggie, who intended it to be used to teach people about Georgism and criticize the economic model that allowed for the creation of monopolies and abusive practices of landlords. Georgism, I don't want to go too deep into it because this is a course about gaming, not economics. But it at the time it kind of got lumped in a lot with socialism. But while they had a lot of some similar goals, it was really more so an alternative theory of capitalism. It was heavily based around the idea of what they call the single land tax, which was intended to kind of to force various landlords and such to develop the land that they owned. It's a very interesting philosophy, and again, I don't want to get too deep into it, but I do recommend checking it out. In the game, players buy and develop property and try to make as much money as they can. The game came with two rule sets, the first of which mimics real life, and it is intentionally boring. And you can kind of see this in modern day Monopoly. If you've ever played it, you'll know that it kind of has two distinct phases. The first half is fun and exciting. Things are happening. Competition is going back and forth. But eventually what happens is that one player gains an advantage and the other players can't really catch up with them, and so it kind of just becomes sort of a lengthy sort of death spiral as you're just waiting for the other players to lose, and it kind of becomes a bit of a slog. And of course, this is done intentionally in order to criticize sort of the traditional landlord model and how it leads to things like monopolies. Now, the alternative rule set actually utilizes Georgism, and as such is much more fun and fair. And you can see how this was used as a form of social commentary. However, the Landlords game failed to really sell very well and was relatively unknown, at least at first. Now, in the early 1900s, different versions of the Landlords game spread throughout the United States. These were generally played on homemade boards with random items from around the house used as playing pieces. So, for example, if you've ever wondered why it is that there's a thimble used in Monopoly, that's actually a reference to that. It was the sort of thing where like you wouldn't buy it from a store, you'd kind of make your own version of it, and you'd share it with your friends, and then they'd make their own versions, and it would kind of spread like that, and it would sort of mutated a bit over time. Of course, it wasn't long before some people tried to commercialize it. In 1932, a version called Finance was published. It had a bit of limited success in the Midwestern United States, but otherwise wasn't really a huge hit. And now, this was at the height of the Great Depression, and one sort of common theme I've kind of discovered is that a lot of things happened in the history of gaming during the Great Depression, and there's a variety of reasons for this. First off, you've got a lot of people who are out of work, who are looking for some sort of entertainment, some way to sort of distract themselves from their dire situation that they're in. You also have a lot of these people who, you have got a lot of stuff like out of work engineers, artists, stuff like craftsmen, stuff like that, who are basically desperate to make money any way that they can. And so oftentimes they will sort of resort to making various games of different sorts. And one example of this is from a man named Charles Darrow, who was an out-of-work heating engineer from Pennsylvania. He played a version of the Landlord game with his neighbors, and he really liked it. He decided he would create his own version and try to sell it. And he called this version Monopoly. Now, Throughout 1933 and 1934, he would attempt to sell the game himself. However, he found that the demand for the game far outpaced his ability to produce it. In 1935, he would finally convince Parker Brothers to publish the game for him. This version of the game lost nearly all of the landlord's social commentary and was all about making money and crushing the competition. And really, that was kind of what made it popular to some extent. People, as again, this was during the Depression when people were very poor, so people kind of liked the idea of this escapist fantasy of being a rich real estate tycoon who was seeking to crush their competition. It very much kind of made for an appealing setting. Parker Brothers, the thing is that Darrow, he kind of plagiarized he kind of plagiarized Monopoly. He as stated before, he copied the Landlord game, but then sort of claimed that it was his own original invention. And Parker Brothers sort of leaned into that. They marketed the game as an original invention of Darrow, sort of an example of the American dream at work, that this ordinary working class person had sort of come up with this great idea and was now raking in tons of money from it. But of course, this wasn't true. The Landlord game had existed for decades by this point and had spread all over the place. And this led to a number of lawsuits, which Parker Brothers ended up settling out of court. Most notably, Elizabeth Magie took Parker Brothers to court. They ended up settling their case on the condition that Parker Brothers would revise their story in order to sort of give Elizabeth Magie her due credit for inventing the idea. And Parker Brothers would publish a version of the Landlord game for national distribution. In fact, if you see here on this previous slide, you can see here on this copy of the Landlord's game, it says here in the corner that it's a Parker Brothers game. This is a version of the version of the game that was published by Parker Brothers. Now, unfortunately, despite being the original inspiration, the Landlord's game would end up effectively bombing, while Monopoly, the game that ripped it off, went on to become the best-selling board game in history. As of 2015, an estimated 275 million copies of the game have been sold worldwide. And to this day, the same game can be bought almost entirely unchanged from its original version. But of course, they've also decided to milk the heck out of this game and have released about 50 million different variations of Monopoly over the years. This is especially a common thing you'll find that Hasbro likes to do whenever they acquire one of these classic board games, is that they'll pump up all kinds of different themed versions of it based on just about every sort of licensed property they can get their hands on. So, like, these are just a few of them. The Pokemon Monopoly was actually the version I had as a kid. I was very much a big fan of Pokemon when it first came out, and I think that was the first version I played. There's some alternate rules versions, such as Monopoly's Cheaters Edition and Miss Monopoly, which actually features a glass ceiling mechanic. I'm not joking. There's even Monopoly Socialism with the tagline, winning is for capitalists. Yeah, really. And of course, they've made it based on every conceivable theme or licensed product you could possibly imagine. There's Harry Potter Monopoly, Monopoly the .com edition, Queen Elizabeth II Monopoly, Bass Fishing Monopoly, National Parks Monopoly, NASCAR Monopoly, Minions Monopoly, Coca-Cola Monopoly, Star Wars Monopoly. In fact, I think there are actually several variations on the Star Wars Monopoly, Monopoly Cats, and so many others. Like, Hasbro really has no shame when it comes to republishing these classic board games. They really just will slap the name. They'll slap whatever licensed name that they can on any of these. And of course, Monopoly would have a massive influence, and this would lead to a number of what I guess you might call opoly games. Um, these are basically various Monopoly copycats, and they essentially they would usually feature a name with opoly at the end of it. So, for example, you have Dogopoly, you have Clintonopoly, Bibleopoly, Kissopoly. You've got in fact, I was at a pharmacy the other day, and I found that at that pharmacy they were selling a version of like a Monopoly clone called Clearwateropoly, which Clearwater being the town that the pharmacy was located in. You know, pretty much everyone has made a Monopoly clone at some point. You've got Squeeze the Juice, which is a Monopoly clone about the O.J. Simpson case. You've got Gay Monopoly. You've got Anti-Monopoly, the trust busting game, which actually I believe led to a number of. I believe it led to a rather interesting series of lawsuits between if not, it was probably Parker Brothers at the time, and the guy who made this. The story of it is actually quite interesting. If you want to check that out, as well as some more information about some of the more absurd Monopoly variants, I definitely recommend there's a YouTube channel called Cam Sandwich. He also does a number of videos about a lot of these classic board games, as we'll see later. Okay, so another sort of Great Depression era board game was Scrabble. In 1931, Alfred Mosher Butts, which, yes, that is his name, don't laugh, would create a game called Criss Crosswords. It is derived from an earlier game that he had created called Lexico that utilized the same sort of letter tiles. Now, letter quantities, for this game, he based on a letter frequency analysis. Basically, he initially created it with an equal number of every letter in the of these tiles, but then he realized that really would not work. The reason being is that it wouldn't work, because then you'd end up with you might end up with a hand that's all consonants, for example. Some letters obviously appear more commonly than others in words. So, like, for example, the letter Z barely appears in anything at all. You might end up stuck with that sort of thing. So what he did was he basically did a letter frequency analysis where he went through a number of various sources, including the New York Times, and sort of carefully counted how frequently various letters appeared over others, and used that to weigh the frequency that these letters would appear in the game, as well as weigh how much each letter would be worth based on their rarity. Now, this new game also added in a board with various spaces that could modify the value of letters and words. The game was not initially all that successful. He was not able to convince any major manufacturers to produce the game, and ended up manufacturing it in very limited quantities himself. Eventually, in 1948, James Brunot bought the rights to manufacture the game in exchange for royalties. He made a few modifications to the board and renamed it Scrabble. For the next several years, Brunnout would struggle to meet demands for the game. It ended up being a massive success, but he couldn't produce enough copies to meet demand, and he ended up licensing the manufacturing rights to Selchow and Ryder, a Long Island manufacturer that had previously rejected the game. Of course, now that it was doing well, they finally saw its worth. They would begin production in 1952, and within only the first 2 years, it would sell over 4 million copies. Selchow Ryder would end up acquiring the trademark for Scrabble in 1972, and since then, it's been a huge success. It's become a ubiquitous board game. In 1984, Scrabble would actually end up being adapted into a game show on NBC. There's also, believe it or not, a competitive Scrabble scene, and apparently there's actually some conflict between there's the version of Scrabble that uses American English versus sort of international English, which is sort of the English that's used in places outside of America. And apparently this creates some issues because I believe that the international English version uses a lot more words. So whenever American players sort of have to go overseas to compete in foreign tournaments, they always have to like memorize a ton more words because, of course, part of the game sort of the competitive aspect comes down to memorizing as many words as possible. In 1988, Selchow and Ryder would be, in 1986, they would be acquired by Coleco, who you probably know of from creating the Cabbage Patch Kids as well as the ColecoVision video game console. And in 1988, they would go bankrupt, and their assets would be acquired by who else but Hasbro. I swear, Hasbro are like the Galactus of board games. They just consume everything. It's starting to get a little late. I guess this will be the last one we go over, and then we'll stop for the night. Next, we'll discuss Clue, or Cluedo, as it's known in most of the rest of the world. It was created by Anthony E. Pratt, a musician and factory worker from Birmingham, England, with the help of his wife, Elva Pratt. During the London Blitz, which of course was the period when the Germans were bombing London, most forms of entertainment and social gathering shut down. And the Pratts very much kind of regretted that aspect. You know, it was probably pretty lonely, pretty sad, for fairly obvious reasons. In particular, one form of pastime that had been popular before the war had been murder mystery party games. Basically, like you'd have a bunch of people show up. One of them would pretend to get murdered, and then the other guest would try to figure out who the culprit was. Now, Anthony, he decided that he wanted to create something similar, which he could be played at home with friends and family, that you wouldn't have to go out to a whole social event to take part in it. Now, he was very heavily influenced by the detective fiction of the time, in particular the works of Agatha Christie, and you can very much see this in the game with its sort of 1920s-esque setting. It's very sort of upper class sort of feel to it and characters, as well as its sort of limited cast of characters that are limited to a specific location. And I believe that in particular he was heavily inspired by the novel And Then There Were None, which also took place in a sort of Victorian style manner. He would create the game which he called Murder in 1943. Players took on the role of one of several characters in a Victorian manner as they attempted to gather clues and figure out which of them was a murderer. The Pratts would end up selling the game to British board game and card game manufacturer Waddington's, who renamed it Cluedo. Waddington's are also a major sort of creator of board games and card games. I don't really mention, we're kind of focusing more on the American side of things here in this lecture, mostly because I have to limit the scope of this somehow, so just bear in mind that there are plenty of other board and card game makers out in the world aside from the ones big ones aside from the ones that I mentioned. They would end up renaming the game Cluedo. Cluedo is a combination of the words clue and ludo, ludo being Latin for I play. Now, due to post-war supply shortages, the game wasn't released until 1949. The game would then be licensed to Parker Brothers in the U.S., who renamed it Clue. Several changes were made. For one thing, several of the murder weapons were changed to make them more family-friendly. The number of potential culprits was cut down. And in the U.S., at least, Colonel Yellow, the character Colonel Yellow, was changed to Colonel Mustard because which is meant to avoid associations with cowardice in the military. This is because the word yellow, to be yellow, means to be cowardly, and they didn't want that sort of affiliation. The game would end up being a massive success, and still kind of has something of a pop culture imprint even to this day. It would spawn numerous updates, spin-offs, and even a successful movie. You can see the movie poster here. It featured Tim Curry and Christopher Lloyd, among others. It's actually quite good. I believe that the original version of it, when it was first released in theaters, different theaters actually had different endings that sort of revealed who the murderer was. Which is definitely very cool. Though I believe that when it eventually came out on video, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, I believe it sort of combined it sort of featured all the endings in one, and that's the version you'll probably find in various streaming services. Numerous changes would be made to the game over the years. For one thing, it would inspire a very popular VHS board game, which we will be discussing the history of VHS board games later on when we get to the 80s and 90s. But needless to say, the Clue version of that was widely considered to be one of the best and most popular of that format. Eventually, Hasbro would acquire both Parker Brothers and Waddington's, and in 2004 they would attempt to update the setting and premise with Clue Discover the Secrets. This one kind of changed the setting to more of a Hollywood manner and changed it kind of took place in the modern day, and the various suspects were kind of Hollywood socialites. People didn't really like it. It was met with quite a lot of pushback. And of course, Hasbro, as they usually do, would release about 1 million different variations of the game. You've got Clue the Big Bang Theory, Clue Golden Girls Edition, yes, really. Clue Friends, Clue The Legend of Zelda. Again, these guys had no shame. It was ridiculous. But it's also important to note that the post-World War II era would see further advances in board gaming, and it's important because this era would see a massive economic boom in the Western world, especially in the U.S., which would lead to a much higher standard of living for the average person to a degree that was completely unprecedented in all of human history. And with greater wealth and financial security, obviously there came more time for leisure activities. And on top of that, at the same time, a massive post-war baby boom led to a large generation of young children growing up in the 50s and 60s. And of course, These young children growing up then, what did they do with all the free time that they now had? They played board games. And all of this predictably led to a major boom in the board game industry from this period. And we will be discussing this further next time. Yeah, this seems like a good place to stop for now. If any of you guys have any questions, now would be a good time to ask. I will give you a couple minutes. Again, I'm really hoping that this new microphone has performed well for this. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any takers, so I guess with that we'll stop it for tonight. I want to thank you all very much for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube or as a VOD, I stream this every week on Wednesday nights at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I hope you'll consider checking it out. The VODs for this should be good for about a week, plus I will post this onto my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@WestwindUniversity. And the Twitch channel is twitch.tv/WestwindUniversity. Thank you. If you are watching this on YouTube, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And I will see you guys next time. Take care.